Okay, welcome everybody to today's webinar presentation, the title of which is Firearms in Colorado, Findings from the 2025 Colorado Firearm Injury Prevention Survey, or what you'll hear, I think, frequently today is the term COFIPS. My name is Joe Simonetti. I am the Director of Education for the Firearm Injury Prevention Initiative at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus. And I'm happy to be here moderating this session. Today, presenting is a friend and colleague, Dr. Erin Kelly, who is the Director of Practice with the Firearm Injury Prevention Initiative and research faculty with the Injury and Violence Prevention Center at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus. Dr. Kelly specializes in research on preventing firearm-related harms, suicide, and community violence, and has extensive experience in translating, disseminating, and supporting the implementation of evidence-based strategies, programs, and policies into practice environments. She's the principal investigator of the Colorado Firearm Injury Prevention Survey, or COFIPS, which you'll be learning more about today. I'm going to pass the microphone and the slides over to her momentarily. Just a quick note, however, we are obviously interested in any questions that you might have. And so if you look on your screen, you should see a Q&A box. Please, as Dr. Kelly is presenting, feel free to post any questions that you might have. Myself and others who are moderating and following the session may be able to respond in real time and answer that question via the chat box. If that is not the case, then at the conclusion of the presentation, Dr. Kelly should have some spare time and we will relay some of those questions to her. So without further ado, Dr. Kelly, thank you for being here today, and I'm going to pass the presentation over to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So thank you everyone for attending today to learn about some of our top level findings from the 2025 administration of the Colorado Firearm Injury Prevention Survey, or what I will refer to as COFIPS from here on out. COFIPS is conducted by the University of Colorado Firearm Injury Prevention Initiative and the Injury and Violence Prevention Center. While I'm the one that is fortunate to be the one presenting today, there are many people from my own team at the university who are involved in the development and administration of COFIPS that I wanted to recognize here. That's Kate, Andrew, Rachel, Jessica, Avery, Caitlin, and amongst others that are kind of primary folks who've been involved. In addition, we are really grateful to be part of a state that has invested in building data infrastructure so we can better assess the impact and prevention of firearm-related harms in our state. We received funding from the Colorado Office of Gun Violence Prevention for administering this survey, and I wanted to specifically acknowledge the staff at this office, the Office of Gun Violence Prevention, Molly, Raina, Barbara, and Kristen, who did provide additional guidance on questions we asked in the survey. We all thank you for your time today and hope COFIPS can be a data source that drives decision-making and collective action in our state. I first want to start with why we need to collect data about the impact and prevention of firearm-related harms in our state. So even at the federal level, we have very limited data to help us understand the impact and prevention of firearm-related harms. Even more, understanding people's perspectives on their experiences with firearms or firearm-related harms, or their opinions about education and prevention efforts is even more limited, especially at the state or local levels. COFIPS is intended to fill those gaps and thus first advances understanding of firearm-related topics. It also provides the opportunity to monitor trends in firearm-related experiences or perspectives over time. And it informs education and prevention efforts that are collaborative, relevant, and responsive to Coloradans' desires. As context, COFIPS began in 2023. I wanted to reflect on those goals since its inception as a result. Related to advancing our understanding of firearm-related topics, we've published 6 manuscripts in peer-reviewed journals with 3 currently under review, and many more are underway right now using the data I'll actually be presenting on today. We've also presented at national and state conferences where we've contributed to advancing what is known on the impact and prevention of these harms. Related to monitoring trends, COFIPS is set up so that in odd years, such as the one I'm presenting on today, we administer the survey to a diverse group of adults in Colorado so that we can get data representative of Colorado adults. We called this the core survey, and 2025 is now the second year we have done this survey following our inaugural survey in 2023. In even years, COFIPS is a specialty survey where we either survey specific groups deeply impacted by firearm-related harms, or groups who are deeply involved in preventing firearm-related harms. In 2024, we administered a survey to Colorado law enforcement officers, and this year in 2026, we will be administer the survey to behavioral health professionals. And finally, related to informing responsive education and prevention of firearm-related harms, there are many statewide efforts to educate Coloradans on prevention of these harms, such as the Let's Talk Guns Colorado campaign and the Colorado Gun Violence Prevention Resource Bank, all of which have used COFIPS data to inform how and what they present to Coloradans. There are also many local efforts that use these data to inform their prevention efforts, and we hope that many others continue to use these data to make informed decisions. So let's dig into more about what the 2025 COFIPS survey is, what we asked, and how we administered the survey. Before I dig in, though, I do want to note that while I'm reporting on data, and those are often numbers, we must remember that these represent people all around us in Colorado, our community members, our neighbors, our friends, and our loved ones who have either lost their life or were injured and are now physically and emotionally healing, and those family members and friends who grieve for those who were died or were injured. The impact on individuals, families, and communities is profound, and it is why we believe understanding and addressing firearm-related harms is a public health concern of our time. We ask questions that allow us to explore three primary areas that I will present on today related to the impact and prevention of firearm-related harms in Colorado. First, we ask about people's experiences of and concerns about violent events and how firearms were involved in these events. Second, we ask about awareness of and opinions on practices and policies aimed at preventing firearm-related harms. Third, we ask about people's access to firearms, if they could access them within their households, about the storage, and if they could, the storage practices that they implement within their households. COFIPS 2025 was administered from June to July of last year. The survey was available in both English and Spanish. We had a total of 1,551 Colorado adults participate in the survey. We worked with Ipsos, which is a global research and marketing firm, to administer the survey to their knowledge panel, which is an online research panel with people chosen using randomized sampling methods. This included 546 of the adults in our sample. Ipsos then recruited an additional 1,006 participants in Colorado who increased the geographic and demographic representation of the participants in Colorado. We then applied design, post-sampling, and post-stratification weights to those responses. These weights account for non-response and standardize our sample. Weights are typical and are often used in survey methods, and as well as in national and state polls that you hear about every day. The purpose behind weights is fundamentally to make sure that everyone's response counts fairly, as it helps add weight to groups that may be underrepresented in the survey. Doing this allows me to use language, which I will use today, which is that Coloradans believe or Coloradans say. So I'll continue to present the findings in that way. So we'll move on to what we found. Given the limited time we have today, I'll only focus on state level results with some kind of breakdowns within those data, but not all of the findings from the survey. Any additional findings and breakdowns of the data, such as the 2023 to 2025 data or comparisons there, or by different demographics, such as sex, race, or ethnicity, or veteran status, or other identity groups, such as those who own firearms or who don't, those will all be available within the next month or so from COFIPS, the COFIPS website, which is cofips.org. So first, to focus on exposure to violent events. We asked a series of questions about how people have experienced injury and violence, including the events that involve firearms. We asked about both their direct experience and among their close social circle of family or friends. We also asked about broader concerns they had regarding violence, and then whether they had made any changes in their lives because of those concerns. We ask these questions because violence not only affects those directly involved through death or injury, but also their family, their friends, neighborhoods, and entire communities. It can have a lasting and far-reaching emotional and psychological impact and can result in fear, changed behaviors, and individual and societal financial consequences as well. So we first asked directly whether Coloradans had been shot or injured or threatened with a firearm. If you look at the blue color here, 3% of Coloradans reported having been shot or injured, which included being shot or being struck with any part of a firearm. Many more reported being threatened with a firearm, which included someone displaying, brandishing, pointing, or verbally threatening to use a firearm. 1 in 5 Coloradans, or 21%, reported having been threatened with a firearm. One note I do want to make about that data point around threatened is that we did not ask whether they were threatened online or in person. So some of this may have taken place online as well. Regardless, being threatened can have enormous emotional and psychological effects on people. Same with being shot or injured, as well as the physical aspect there as well. So you can also see that we compared being shot, injured, or threatened between those who also reporting having firearms in the home, which is in red, versus those who do not have firearms in the home, which is in blue. And more adults with firearms in the home actually reported having been shot or injured or threatened. We then asked Coloradans if they had either been injured themselves or had a close family member or friend who had experienced any of the following events that you can see listed here. So while 3 in 5 or 60% of Coloradans had never experienced one of these violent events directly or in their close social circles, you can see here that 1 in 4 people had experienced a suicide close to them, with half of those suicides involving firearms. That's the red line that you see there. And you can also see that 1 in 10 had experienced a homicide, with 3/4 of those homicides involving firearms. 8% had experienced spouse or partner violence, with about 1/4 of those involving a firearm, and 7% had experienced accidental shootings. Overall, 4% of Colorado adults, or nearly 1 in every 20 Colorado adult, reported having experienced a mass shooting, a school shooting, or a police-involved shooting, either themselves or in their close social circle, family, or friends. We also wanted to ask about people's concerns about experiencing these violent events. As we know, concerns can lead to fear and people changing behaviors. This graph shows the percent of Colorado adults who are at least somewhat concerned about each of these events happening to themselves or their close family or friends. As you can see, it shows that over half of adults were concerned about each of these events. While Coloradans were most concerned about mass shootings and school shootings, these events are more rare than other events happening here in Colorado. Over the latest 5-year period of data, 2% of the firearm-related deaths in Colorado were due to a mass or school shooting event. While concerns about suicide were a bit lower, in that same 5-year period, suicide deaths accounted for 70% of the firearm-related deaths in Colorado. You can also see that the political violence is also our 3rd highest here as well, which I wanted to flag given recent concerns in our country. Given these concerns, we wanted to ask Coloradans if they felt that they had any more changes in their lives to address these concerns. So as you can see, 2 in 3 Colorado adults reported they had changed their behaviors as a response to concerns about any of these violent events they had. I'll walk through those. So for these responses, people could say that they had changed their behaviors in multiple ways, so these do not add up to 100. Many reported behaviors that demonstrated avoidance, which can diminish social interactions and community connectedness that we feel with one another. 1 in 3 adults avoided large crowds, such as music festivals or crowded bars or clubs. Over 1 in 10 avoided attending religious or cultural events, and nearly 2 in 10, 17%, said they avoided public transit. In addition, over 1 in 20, or 6%, took pretty dramatic steps to change their schools their children attended, or even where they lived, as a result of their concerns about violent events happening in their lives. Many people also started talking to their family more about firearm safety or protecting themselves against firearm violence, as you see here, 19% to 30%. And finally, fewer talk directly to professionals about their concerns, such as discussing it with healthcare provider or law enforcement, but still some folks that were starting to talk to others about concerns. The last one we wanted to flag is that because of concerns related to violent events, often many of those that involved firearms directly, many people took on more firearm-related behaviors. Nearly 1 in 5, 18% of adults said that they purchased a firearm due to their concerns, and 1 in 4 attended a firearm safety class or practiced shooting a firearm. We also include a link to a publication some of our colleagues wrote about these findings from the 2023 COFIPS survey, which has a more extensive discussion of how this can impact entire communities and society. I'm going to shift over to talking about a series of questions we had relating to understanding who people were talking to or learning from about firearm injury prevention, so we could better understand who the messengers are and who the most appropriate messengers might be to prevent firearm-related harms in Colorado. So first, we wanted to understand ways in which conversations about household storage of firearms might be integrated into regular conversations that occur. First, we asked about people's belief on how appropriate it was for parents or guardians to ask how firearms are stored before their children visit or spend time in other people's homes. 9 in 10 adults believed that it was at least sometimes appropriate to ask directly about how firearms are stored. And I wanted to also flag that 53% of those adults believed it was always appropriate for parents or guardians to ask this before their children went to someone else's house. The two QR codes at the bottom of this are related. We published findings on the left from the 2023 COFIPS survey, and then on the right is actually a Larimer County video that's an educational video that demonstrates how you can push past any awkwardness you might feel and ask about firearms if you are a parent or adult and your children is going over to someone else's home. In addition, we asked about appropriateness of doctors and health professionals talking to their patients about how firearms are stored. Here, 3 in 4 adults believed it was sometimes appropriate for healthcare professionals to ask about this, and 1 in 3, 30%, believed it was always appropriate. We have a publication underway right now using both 2023 and 2025 data about this data point, so encourage you to sign up for a newsletter so that you can access that published as well. We also asked about how people are learning about firearm injury prevention. Note here that people again could report learning about prevention in multiple ways, so those don't add up to 100% here either. As you can see, the primary responses in black were the people are having conversations with those closest to them, with almost 49% and 42% reporting talking to their family and friends about firearm injury prevention. This is really a reminder that everyday conversations you're having are important and that they matter. We also asked about online learning. Television, the internet, and social media, which you see here in red, are where about 1 in 4 Coloradans suggest that they are learning about firearm injury prevention. Closer to 1 in 10 people also know they are learning about prevention from podcasts, the radio, and newsletters of various organizations, which are in the gold color at the bottom. Moreover, we also asked about whether they are learning about things in physical places or direct interactions with others where they may be spending their time. As you can see here, 1 in 4 people say they are learning about prevention through firearm businesses, which are where a lot of educational efforts are happening related to firearm safety and injury prevention. 1 in 4 also said they were learning about firearm injury prevention from their place of work, which we found interesting. Fewer are learning about it through posters or billboards or in other interactions, such as with law enforcement, schools, healthcare, churches, or other agencies, but still some are learning in those places as well. I'll go ahead and transition now to findings about Coloradans' reports of access to firearms, and if they did, their household storage practices. We're particularly interested in firearm storage because securely storing firearms is an important way to prevent firearm-related harms when people can access firearms. I first want to go over how people reported firearm access in the survey itself. So we asked about whether people both personally owned firearms as well as whether or not they had access to firearms in their home, whether or not they owned those firearms. So as you can see here, almost half of Colorado reports either having a firearm in their household or personally owning at least one firearm. So it could have been a combination of those two things. When we break those down into separate questions, 37% report having a firearm in the home and 35% report personally owning a firearm. I'm going to dig into these different data points just a little bit here. So if you go through this, what that actually means is that about 1 in 4 people, so 25%, have access to firearms in the home, but they don't personally, and they personally own that firearm. However, 1 in 10, so 10%, have access to firearms in the home, but they don't personally own that firearm. And then another almost 1 in 10, 9%, actually own firearms, but don't report that they have access to those firearms in their household. So an example of what that could be, that latter part, is that might be someone who uses firearms for their job, but stores them away from their home, or uses firearms for hunting or recreation, but also stores those firearms away from the family's home at that point in time. So they access them from some other location, whether it's a family member's or they store them at a retailer, whatever it might be. And the final point I wanted to make around firearm access is that 17% of Coloradans reported having both children and firearms in the home. This data point is particularly important given efforts to prevent unauthorized access to firearms among children who can access within their homes. So again here, nearly 1 in 5 households should be attentive to this. Given that secure firearm storage is so important for protecting against potential harms in households with firearms, we asked about beliefs and varying reasons why people might securely store firearms. Overall, and frankly, with little difference between those who do in yellow and don't have firearms in the home, which is in red, we found that people generally agree that securely storing firearms reduces the risk of injury and death involving a firearm, which you see at top, and then even slightly higher agreement that it reduces that particular risk for children, which you see in the middle. We also asked whether people agreed that temporarily removing firearms from the home, if someone was in crisis, would reduce the injury of or the risk of injury and death involving a firearm, with 4 in 5 agreeing this would help. Temporarily and voluntarily removing firearms if someone is in crisis helps create time and space for someone to access support and care for their mental health without the risk of access to firearms during this time. For those who had access to firearms in their home, we asked about how they stored their firearms. We asked about locking and then loading, and then have a combination kind of question that I'll go over in here as well, since all of those are kind of separate practices that people might employ to securely store their firearms. So remember that 1 in 10 people had access to household firearms but didn't own. Those actually accounted for the large majority of responses where people actually didn't know. So we're only reporting on those who knew how their household firearms were locked, loaded, or the combination of both. So we found that nearly 3 in 5 Coloradans, so 58%, locked all of their household firearms. 42% had at least one firearm that was unlocked, and 21% actually had all of their household firearms that were completely unlocked. So locking firearms, whether with cabinets, safes, cable locks, or trigger locks, was pretty consistent across whether people owned long guns or handguns. So long guns in red here and handguns of the yellowish goldish color here. So shifting over to whether or not people reported loading or keeping their firearms unloaded. We asked separately about this, and we again found that about 3 in 5 Coloradans keep all of their household firearms unloaded, which does mean that 38% of households had at least one firearm in the home that was loaded. So an additional 9% reported that they kept all of their household firearms loaded. We did see here that keeping household firearms loaded or unloaded differed quite a bit between handguns and long guns. If you look at the middle one here, that's kind of the most dramatic piece, showing that 37% had at least one handgun unloaded versus 15% had at least one long gun unloaded, which, as we've worked with our different firearm community partners, is likely because many people use handguns for self-defense in their homes. So this is the combination of whether or not households are locking and unloading their firearms together. So we found here that over 2 in 5 households, so 43%, actually both lock and unload all of their household firearms at this point. But noting here that that is actually a more common practice if you look at the red among the long guns in the home. We did subsequently ask adults who implemented these practices for all of their firearms why they did this. So many people had multiple responses, but 9 in 10 said that they did it just because they believed securely storing firearms was important. An additional 56% said they wanted to prevent unauthorized access by children in the home. That was the rationale for doing so. 45% said they wanted to keep the firearms in good condition, and 33% wanted to actually prevent theft of their firearms. We also asked about vehicle storage. So we limited this question to how they stored the firearms in the past 30 days so that they could better recall those previous 30 days. So while over half said they had not stored firearms in their vehicle during that 30-day period, Of the 43% who did, 1 in 4 said that they always locked the firearms in their vehicle, while over half said that they never locked the firearms. Locking firearms, and the reason why we ask this, is the best practice for preventing theft of firearms and subsequent trafficking of these firearms for use in interpersonal violence in our communities. We also asked households if they had a plan for temporary and voluntary storage outside their home, if anyone was ever at risk of harming themselves. While 1 in 4, 20%, had a plan if needed, an additional 1 in 10 don't know if they have a plan. Of those who didn't know if they had a plan for out-of-home storage, we did make a note that 1 in 4 people who said that they didn't own the firearm, but there's one within their home, were the ones who actually didn't know about whether or not this plan existed. This is particularly important for these individuals to know if the firearm owner, or for the other folks within the home to know if the firearm owner is actually the person at risk of harming themselves. Of the 3 in 5, 62% who said that they did not have a plan, we did ask why they didn't have one. 65% reported not thinking that their household needed a plan, but many others simply needed more information about why and how they could store firearms outside the home. We include information here in this QR code about locations where firearm businesses in Colorado provide on-site storage of firearms if people are interested in learning more about this information in the future. Finally, we also asked about whether people were interested in voluntarily and permanently removing firearms from their household in the upcoming year. 7% of Coloradans reported they were interested in permanently removing household firearms in the next year, and an additional 7% were unsure if they would be. People may be interested in this because they no longer use the firearms, whether it's for work, recreation, or hunting. The firearm no longer functioned properly and they don't want to repair it. They inherited but don't want the firearm. They feel unsafe with the firearm in the household, or they have other household safety features and do not see firearms as part of their household security. And removal here may be something along the lines of selling or surrendering at different events. Additionally, we asked about training and classes on firearm safety. This could also be an important way to provide education on preventing firearm-related harms. We found that of those with firearms in the household, 2 in 3 adults, 66%, had taken a training or a class about firearm safety. For those who personally owned the firearm, that actually went up to 82%, or closer to 4 in 5 people who had taken a safety or education class. This means that those with household access, that those who didn't own, are a bigger proportion of those who would not have taken these classes, despite potentially being able to access the firearm. We also ask about what information the trainings included relating to preventing firearm-related harms. While 9 in 10 discussed unloading firearms, locking firearms, preventing children and unauthorized users from accessing, and preventing accidental injuries, we wanted to flag that less than half, just 44%, discussed preventing suicide involving firearms. This is despite the fact that in Colorado, 70% of firearm-related deaths are suicide. And finally, I'll transition to the final part of our findings today that we're presenting on, which is about Colorado adults' awareness of and support for firearm-related policies. Laws and policies, when carefully designed and monitored, can help reduce firearm deaths, injuries, and related harms by shaping societal expectations, protecting those at higher risk, and influencing resources available for protection, for prevention, intervention, and recovery. These measures should balance individual rights with community safety and be regularly evaluated. Data on Coloradans' knowledge of and support for firearm-related laws can strengthen existing policies and inform future decisions. Overall, we found that many Coloradans are aware of existing laws that are intended to prevent firearm-related harms, with those with firearms in the home being slightly more aware of these laws than those without firearms. As you can see here, just over half of those with firearms in the home were aware of the safe storage of firearms law that requires that firearm owners store their firearms in a way that does not allow access by unauthorized users, such as those who are prohibited by federal law from owning, or from children. And we're aware that firearms in the next one down and vehicles should be stored in a locked container and out of plain view. However, nearly 7 in 10 of those with firearms in the home knew that firearm owners were required to report lost or stolen firearms to law enforcement. While over while only just over half, or 53% of Coloradans were aware of Colorado's extreme risk protection order law, a higher proportion of those with firearms in the home were aware of this law. This law allows certain individuals to ask a judge to temporarily limit a person's ability to have or buy firearms if they are believed to be an immediate danger to themselves or others. Overall, only 42% of Coloradans, with a slightly higher proportion of those who have firearms in the home, were aware that Colorado has a law that prohibits possession of firearms that can be made by individuals and do not have a serial number, which are commonly referred to as ghost guns. Finally, many people also falsely thought that Colorado had a few laws in place. First, almost half of Coloradans believed that a background check was required prior to transferring or gifting a firearm to an immediate family member. However, there is an exception to background checks in Colorado, which allows people to transfer these firearms to an immediately family member if they are the right age and are legally allowed to own. Because people might trust family members to hold their firearms if they are in crisis, they may be an important part of a suicide prevention plan. Second in that right, about half of Colorado adults believe that individuals can be added to a state or federal registry of firearm owners when they purchase firearms. However, that is false. Colorado and federal law prohibits the development of registries to track firearm ownership. We also asked about people's support or opposition to firearm-related policies that do not currently exist in Colorado, but are either widely discussed or exist in other states. Overall, Coloradans reported they supported or strongly supported policies that could increase safety while protecting individual rights. The highest support overall was for preventing persons with severe mental illness from owning firearms, as well as ensuring all abusers who are issued a domestic violence protection order are required to turn over their firearms, and allowing health insurance companies to reimburse organizations providing violence intervention services. That might be things like responding to and de-escalating violent situations, mentoring individuals at risk for violence, or connecting them with resources and services. Requiring the completion of a firearm safety course before the purchase of a firearm was also high, though fewer of those still quite high at 77% of those with firearms in the home supported that policy. Nearly 8 in 10 Coloradans supported a policy requiring a permit to purchase a firearm, and that's actually nearly 7 in 10 of those with firearms in the home who also demonstrated support for this policy. And overall, 77% of Colorado adults and 62% of those with firearms in the home supported a policy requiring legal firearm owners to obtain a permit to open carry. In Colorado, a permit is currently required to conceal carry. We also asked about an additional widely debated policy about allowing staff in K-12 schools to carry firearms on school grounds, finding that overall half of Colorado adults support this policy and 60% of those with firearms in the home support the policy. Finally, we also asked about when people believed extreme risk protection orders were at least sometimes appropriate in various scenarios. Across all 5 of the scenarios listed here related to risk of harming oneself or potentially others, 9 in 10 Colorado adults believed each of these were at least sometimes appropriate. I did want to note on this one that we did not ask the question, do you think ERPOs are appropriate, or what they're commonly referred to as red flag laws. We actually described what ERPOs are intended to do in this question, so essentially allowing a judge to determine if a person is at immediate risk of harming themselves or others, and then whether or not they believe these scenarios were an appropriate reason to do that. We actually recently released more information about ERPOs in Colorado, so if you can follow this link to learn more about ERPOs specifically, it's a great place to learn more about this subject specifically. Finally, I just wanted to talk about where I think we all go from here, given what we've presented on today. So first, we hope that you can use these findings to inform steps you take as an individual or organization to address firearm injury and violence. As an individual, you can certainly take steps that are supported by these data. For example, if you are a parent or a guardian and your child is going to a friend's home, you can take that step of having a conversation to make sure that home is storing their firearms securely while your child is present if they have firearms. You can also talk to your family and friends about preventing firearm-related harms and what steps you are taking to do so. It's very clear that people are starting to engage, and we encourage people to engage in those conversations. If you're a healthcare provider, consider asking about storage and providing education to patients or parents of patients. If you're a firearm owner, there is a firearm in your home, you can learn more about secure storage practices for your firearms and make a plan about how you would temporarily store your firearms if you ever have a circumstance and where your family needs to store those outside the home. You can also take additional firearm safety classes at your local firearm business. These findings can also inform the practices of community organizations or government agencies to address firearm injury and violence. Organizations can use these data to apply for funding, to advance their efforts to prevent firearm-related harms in their communities, and to make data-driven decisions about what these programs or strategies could be that would help to prevent these harms. To inform your individual and organizational efforts, we encourage you to access additional resources currently available on the COFIPS website and coming soon, many of which are data briefs and links to publications on key issues, some of which I've discussed today, among others. While there are resources already available to you on the COFIPS website now, we're working very hard to also produce additional resources. There are 2 new briefs that were referenced here today on exposure to violence and on awareness of and support for different policies in Colorado that are already available on that website. There's also peer-reviewed publications, and we have a dashboard that will be coming soon as well. To learn more about when we release these data products, please sign up for the CU Firearm Injury Prevention Initiative newsletter here at the bottom right. And we announce in those newsletters when those resources are available. And then also there's the Firearm Injury Prevention website and the email address if you have any questions, and I'll stop share.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Kelly. And I just want to also say thanks to Avery Moji, who has been putting some really helpful resources, I think, in the chat box. Just make sure that people have noticed those. We've answered a couple questions on your behalf while you're presenting, Dr. Kelly, but there are a couple open that I'd like to send your way. So one person asked, I'm curious if there are any publications or resources we can review to learn more about the findings from the law enforcement survey.
Yeah, great question. Thank you for that. We are working on a series of publications that would have data briefs that go alongside those findings. We did ask specifically around 3 different areas, I think, for law enforcement officers. One was their perspectives around ERPOs, when they have not used them, any barriers that they wanted addressed. And I note that one specifically because actually a really great part of that survey was that all of those data were integrated into a training that is ongoing of law enforcement officers in Colorado to help normalize different law enforcement perspectives on using ERPOs across our state. So those data were actually used right away in current practice and training, which was wonderful. We did also ask about their perspectives about citing people for the safe storage law, which is one I mentioned in this presentation, but that's primarily around if people have not locked their firearms in a home with children or those who are prohibited from accessing firearms by federal law, and asked about different questions and resources that might need to be available for those. So for those specifically, again, sign up for the FIPI newsletter if you haven't, because those will be released as we have them.
Great. Just a reminder, folks, we've got a few minutes left if you want to post more questions. I had one maybe question or point I was hoping you could maybe provide some insight on. So you talked about this kind of acceptability of parents asking about how firearms are stored before play dates, which I think before I saw your data and you shared this with me before, was a really uncomfortable thing for me as a parent, quite frankly. And it has been really helpful to see those data to sort of give me a little bit of confidence to know that actually when I ask these questions before my kids go to another house, actually it's not so absurd and potentially upsetting. And so maybe as a non-owner, that's something that I get more confident with. I'm curious, like what guidance you would have for gun owners who are also parents or guardians. Do you have any thoughts about what gun owners themselves could be doing to make those questions a little bit easier to ask before play dates and social settings with kids?
Yeah, I think this is a conversation that parents and guardians can negotiate together too. So I will, before I answer Joe's specific question there, I will just say that I do think that one thing I will clarify in there is the way we ask this question on our survey is actually just around asking people how they store their
Mhm.
firearms,
Thank you for
which
clarifying.
actually jumps over the potentially awkward question, which is, do you have firearms? So, in some sense, you can make an assumption of whether or not they have those firearms. Like, hey, if you have firearms, do you mind making sure that those are locked and unloaded while my kid's over tomorrow? Whatever it is, right? So, it goes past the two question piece, which is this, do you have them? And then also, if you do, here you go. And I think that's kind of the piece for me of navigate safety at every level, right? If they have a pool and you already know that, you might be saying, like, hey, is that covered while my kid is there? Like he or she or they have not been in lessons yet. And so I want to make sure that they're safe. These are all just like assume different things and make sure that you're comfortable as a parent or guardian with any safety precautions, which is gets me to your question, which I think is the same of like, don't assume that anyone's going to react to your kind of statement up front. You could even say like the firearms that are in the household are locked and unloaded while they're here or something like that. So you're navigating those safety questions up front as well. And you'd be asking those questions of other households as well. So
Yeah.
again, it's about kind of normalizing that conversation as this is a safety issue. We're going to talk about this comprehensively.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for clarifying the question as well. And we have another question. Will these data be broken out by urban versus rural residents, basically?
Yes, once the data are live on the COFIPS website, they will. There's also an additional category of suburban in there as well, which I think is important. We actually found more access in suburban areas in 2023. So I think that's an increasing area to be discussing as well. But then there are things like race and ethnicity, gender, veteran status, education level, income level, all of those different breakdowns are available.
Great. We have, oh, great, a couple other questions added. Do you have any thoughts on the 50% of interviewed respondents who were um, endorsing the policy of teachers carrying firearms?
Yeah, I so I will say I am part of the University of Colorado Firearm Injury Prevention Initiative, as we discussed, which is very neutral and nonpartisan in terms of our approach. So I don't have any particular thoughts about different policies and thoughts around those pieces. I would say generally, and it's part of our kind of conversation from the start around firearm related policies, you want to carefully balance individual rights with community safety. And I think that broader policymakers and citizens need to have a very important conversation around whether or not carrying would increase or increase safety in a school or actually increase risk, particularly around children who might be able to access too. So I think that will be a hotly debated topic, and one that we found was probably higher supported than I think we might have found otherwise. So ongoing discussion, absolutely, but to me, it's very much the balance of what actually would be what keeps children safe in the school system.
Thank you. And Heather Kennedy just asked, did you all ask specific questions or prompts regarding parents talking with their teens about navigating firearms in a home that they are visiting? It seems like parents are not always involved in play dates as a child becomes a teen.
That's a great question. We did not ask about that specifically. So I would maybe subset that into a conversation. In some sense, I think that if a parent or guardian is asking about younger children and access, I do hope that they're also talking to their children and young people about it. The only equivalent question, which I didn't present on, is that we do ask adults what they're talking with their children about if they have firearms in the home, but that's only if they had firearms in the home. And it's things like, are you training? Are you talking about safety and handling all those different pieces? So a data point there would be available, but it's a great and an important question that you just brought up.
That is a great question, and I don't have the ability to post, so I just asked Avery to post for me. For those of you looking for conversation guides or conversation starters or potential scripts you can use if you were to begin asking about firearms where your kids go to visit, the Ad Council developed a great program, in my opinion, called Agree to Agree. And in here in the link that Avery is posting now, there are a lot of different scripts and conversation starters for a bunch of different types of firearm related conversations. But one of them is if your kid's going to go somewhere, how you might ask other parents and guardians about the status of the firearms in the household. I think it's a pretty good resource, so it might be worth looking at. Oh, and Dr. Vargas also commented on agree to agree. So I'll take that as an endorsement of that. Thanks. Thanks, Dr. Vargas. Okay. And with that, I don't see any other questions being posted. I know at the end you did leave some contact information. If people have follow-up questions, we can always be contacted at the Firearm Injury Prevention Initiative. I just want to thank you again, Dr. Kelly, for presenting these updated findings. We really appreciate your expertise in helping us understand, Colorado and Coloradans and the landscape of firearm injury prevention here. Thank you, everybody. I want to wish you all a nice day, and we'll see you for our next webinar.